This bone box found in Jerusalem has a Hebrew inscription on it with just a name. The name is Yochanan ben Chagakul.
Yeah, I believe that Christ's suffering and the demonstration of the kind of physiologic stress that his human body was under is manifested in the Garden of Gethsemane, where it's described that he was sweating blood.
The crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most significant events in Christian theology. It stands as the central moment in the Gospels, the climax of Jesus' life and mission, and the point of convergence for both historical inquiry and religious belief. Understanding whether this event happened as the Bible describes requires us to delve into history, medical science, and archaeology, while balancing that with the theological weight the crucifixion holds for millions of believers around the world. The Roman world was no stranger to public execution, and among their cruelest methods was crucifixion. This form of execution was designed not only to kill, but to humiliate and serve as a public deterrent. For the Romans, it was the ultimate punishment for rebels, criminals, and non-citizens, those who posed a threat to the established order. Historians of the period, including writers like Tacitus and Josephus, attest to this widespread practice. But how do their accounts align with the biblical description of the crucifixion? Tacitus, a Roman historian, writes of Christus, the founder of the Christian faith, who was executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Josephus, a Jewish historian, offers a slightly more detailed account. He refers to Jesus as a wise man, a doer of wonderful works, who was condemned to death by crucifixion. Both of these sources, written by those outside the Christian faith, give credence to the crucifixion of Jesus as a historical event. They validate the basic framework of what is described in the Gospels, an execution by crucifixion during the governance of Pilate. However, as historians, we must ask whether these texts provide evidence of the event as the Gospels describe, or whether they simply reflect a common knowledge of an executed man called Jesus. The Gospels themselves, as the primary sources, offer the most detailed accounts of Jesus' crucifixion. Written by those who were either close to Jesus or influenced by first-hand witnesses, they present a consistent narrative. Jesus is arrested, tried, and eventually executed on a Roman cross, flanked by two criminals. The descriptions vary slightly between the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but the core event remains unchanged. Despite being a foundational text for Christians, critics often debate the reliability of these accounts as historical documents. Were these writings theological reflections, or are they grounded in historical fact? Scholars frequently point to the internal consistency of the Gospels as evidence of their historical reliability, but others challenge this by noting the theological motivations behind the text. Moving beyond historical sources, let's consider the medical aspects of the crucifixion as described in the Bible. The Gospels give us details that, when examined through a modern medical lens, provide compelling evidence of the physical realities of crucifixion. Jesus is described as being scourged, beaten, and then nailed to a cross where he ultimately dies after several hours. From a medical perspective, the details align with what we know about crucifixion as a form of execution. Scourging alone was often enough to kill a person, causing severe blood loss, shock, and trauma. Being nailed to a cross would exacerbate the victim's suffering, leading to a slow death by asphyxiation. Medical professionals who have studied the crucifixion describe it as one of the most brutal forms of execution ever devised, and the descriptions in the Gospels seem to match what we know from Roman records and modern reconstructions. Before the crucifixion, Jesus was scourged by Roman soldiers, which was a brutal form of punishment. The scourging was typically done with a whip, called a flagrum, which had leather thongs embedded with bits of bone and metal. When struck, these thongs would tear into the skin and underlying muscles, causing severe lacerations, bruising, and blood loss. The damage from this flogging would have weakened Jesus considerably, leaving his body in a state of shock before he even reached the cross. From a medical standpoint, this flogging could have caused hypovolemic shock, a condition where the body loses a significant amount of blood. Symptoms would include rapid heart rate as the body struggles to maintain blood pressure, sweating, dizziness, and extreme thirst as the body loses fluids. Weakness and possible collapse as blood loss reduces the supply of oxygen to the brain. Jesus was then forced to carry the patibulum, or the horizontal beam of the cross, which weighed around 75 to 125 pounds. Already weakened from the scourging, Jesus likely struggled under this weight, leading to further physical exhaustion and collapse, as recorded when Simon of Cyrene was ordered to carry the cross for him. The struggle to carry the cross would have further exacerbated the symptoms of hypovolemic shock. Once at Golgotha, Jesus was nailed to the cross. The Roman method of crucifixion involved driving large nails through the wrists rather than the palms, which would prevent the nails from tearing through the flesh as the victim's body weight hung on the cross. The wrist contains the median nerve, and when the nail was driven through, it would have caused intense, searing pain as the nerve was damaged. This phenomenon is known as causalgia, or severe burning pain caused by nerve trauma. The nails in the feet would have also been driven through areas filled with nerves, causing similar intense pain and making any movement on the cross excruciating. One of the most torturous aspects of crucifixion was the mechanism of death, which typically involved asphyxiation. Hanging by the arms, the chest muscles would have been stretched and the diaphragm unable to function properly, making it difficult to exhale. To breathe, the victim would have to push up with their feet, pressing against the nails driven through the ankles or feet, causing excruciating pain. This constant cycle of pushing up to breathe and then collapsing due to exhaustion would have continued for hours, leading to gradual suffocation. As Jesus' body struggled to compensate for the trauma, blood loss, and the intense strain on his muscles, his heart would have been working harder to supply oxygen to the tissues. Over time, this can lead to cardiac distress or heart failure. The Gospels record that after his death, a Roman soldier pierced Jesus' side with a spear, and blood and water flowed out. This description is consistent with pericardial effusion, or pleural effusion, where fluid accumulates around the heart and lungs, a likely result of the traumatic stress on the body during crucifixion. This final act of the spear piercing Jesus' side could have struck his heart or lungs, releasing a mixture of blood and the fluid that had built up around the lungs, the water described in the Gospels. Death by crucifixion could take hours or even days, depending on the severity of the flogging and the physical condition of the victim. Jesus' death, occurring within about 6 hours, suggests that his pre-crucifixion ordeal, scourging, carrying the cross, and the prolonged struggle to breathe, hastened his demise. Medically, it is believed Jesus likely died of exhaustion, asphyxia, or hypovolemic shock, combined with cardiac failure due to the immense physical stress. Beyond the physical pain, Jesus would have experienced significant psychological stress. The feeling of abandonment, as noted when he cried, my God, why have you forsaken me?" combined with the public humiliation, emotional agony, and mental exhaustion from the intense pain and suffering only added to the trauma. From a theological point of view, Jesus' physical suffering during the crucifixion serves to highlight the extent of his sacrifice for humanity. The medical brutality of the crucifixion underscores the profound cost of redemption in Christian teaching. His death is seen as atonement for sin, and the extreme nature of his physical suffering is often emphasized to show the depth of God's love for humankind. But beyond the physical realities, what about the cultural and religious context? For first-century Jews, the crucifixion would have been seen as a particularly shameful death, one that marked Jesus as cursed by God. As described in the Torah, cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. Yet early Christians saw this same event as the ultimate victory. The crucifixion for them was not just the execution of a revolutionary, it was the fulfillment of prophecy, the necessary sacrifice for the salvation of humankind. The early Christian community, particularly those closest to Jesus, framed the crucifixion as a pivotal moment in God's redemptive plan. This theological interpretation shaped how the event was recorded and remembered, but does that diminish its historical accuracy? Turning to the burial of Jesus, we find another point of convergence between history and theology. According to the Gospels, Jesus was buried in a tomb provided by Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish council. Roman practice did not typically allow for crucified individuals to receive proper burials. Bodies were often left on the cross to rot or be eaten by animals. However, exceptions could be made, especially in regions like Judea, where religious customs, such as those surrounding the Sabbath, were taken into account. The Gospels claim that Jesus' body was taken down and placed in a tomb before sunset to comply with Jewish burial laws. Archaeological findings in the region have uncovered evidence of tombs dating from this period, some even containing remains that show signs of crucifixion. This lends credibility to the Gospel accounts of Jesus being buried in a rock-hewn tomb, though the details of the tomb itself remain a matter of faith and interpretation. Of course, the narrative does not end with the burial. The resurrection of Jesus, as described in the New Testament, is the cornerstone of Christian belief. Historically speaking, the resurrection is the most debated aspect of the crucifixion story. The empty tomb and appearances of the risen Jesus are detailed in the Gospels. But do these accounts hold up under scrutiny? Some historians argue that the resurrection is purely a matter of faith, while others suggest that something extraordinary must have occurred to spark the rapid growth of the Christian movement. The empty tomb in particular raises historical questions. Was Jesus' body stolen, as some critics suggest? Did the disciples fabricate the resurrection story? Or did they truly witness the risen Christ? Scholars have debated these questions for centuries, and the lack of physical evidence leaves much of the debate open to interpretation. Now hear me out. There are 4 ancient biographies of Jesus. They were all written by eyewitnesses and/or based on eyewitness testimony. They were written and circulated while many other eyewitnesses were still alive. These biographies all say that Jesus rose from the dead. These biographies are supplemented by letters written by eyewitnesses, while many other eyewitnesses were still alive. These ancient letters claim that Jesus died by crucifixion and that on the 3rd day he rose from the dead. Pagan and Jewish writers report that Christians believe Jesus rose from the dead. Many of the principal eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus died because of their claim that Jesus was resurrected. Their lives would probably have been spared if they recanted. This is very significant. We know that people will die for a cause, but these men and women died for a set of facts. They went to their graves rather than say that the facts were untrue. They died because they said the facts of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus were true. The eyewitness story told by John is very important. Many people today will claim that John's story, like the other eyewitness stories, is meant to be understood as a story of symbol and metaphor. However, we know that John clearly understood the difference between telling a historical story and telling a story overflowing with symbol and metaphor. Why? Because he wrote 2 books, one that very clearly claims to be historical. We now know this book as the Gospel of John, and one book that is clearly all about symbol and metaphor. We now know this as the Book of Revelation. So John is an important witness of what happened in the death and resurrection of Jesus. The historical evidence shows that the grave was empty. The grave clothes were neatly left behind. The stone enclosing the tomb was rolled away. The body of Jesus was never found. The grave had been guarded by Roman soldiers, and no one ever claimed to have stolen the body. The presence of the grave clothes is significant. It was the spices attached to the cloth that had value. Anyone removing the body for profit or mischief would have taken the wrapped body away and separated out the valuable mixture at their leisure. In fact, the placement of the grave clothes, like the placement of the stone, perfectly fits with the resurrection as the cause, rather than with human agency as the cause. There are, not counting Paul, 11 recorded times that Jesus appeared to people, proving that he was resurrected. These appearances were to men and women, individuals, couples, groups, and at least one crowd. The appearances were inside and outside, in different locations, and at different times of the day. He was physically touched, audibly heard, visually seen, and he ate food in the presence of witnesses. None of these witnesses believed that Jesus would rise from the dead before he rose from the dead. All of them knew him before his death, so they knew he was the same Jesus who died on the cross. In the very place where Jesus died and was buried, there was an explosion of growth in the Christian movement, centered on the claim that the grave was empty and that Jesus had truly risen. This explosion of growth happened mere weeks after the death and resurrection of Jesus in the place where he died. The growth happened in the face of hostility, opposition, and persecution from civil and religious leaders. The death and resurrection of Jesus was not a random event. Jesus predicted that he would die by crucifixion, be buried, and rise from the dead. His prediction that he would die from crucifixion is very significant. He could not control that. Crucifixion was a means of death reserved for the imperial Roman authorities. Jesus claimed reasonably that his death by crucifixion and his resurrection on the third day would be a sign that vindicated who he was, what he taught, and what he would accomplish by his death and resurrection. The death and resurrection of Jesus also took place in the context of centuries of prophecy that such a Messiah would come from God and die and rise. Jesus himself claimed that his life, death, and resurrection was a fulfillment of these prophecies. There is more. The death and resurrection of Jesus take place in the context of an overarching story that has deep and powerful insights into the human condition. His life, death, and resurrection took place in the context of a body of writings that have proved for millennia to be wise and insightful about the human condition. These writings have been the basis for the development of science, human rights, and good government. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus took place in the context of a worldview that is unsurpassed in its breadth, depth, coherence, consistency, and emotional and rational power. Friends, consider Jesus, crucified, risen Savior, loving Lord. Come to him with humble trust. In considering the crucifixion, we must also look at the critics and skeptics who propose alternative theories. Some claim that Jesus did not actually die on the cross, but merely fell into a deep coma, known as the swoon theory, and later revived in the tomb. Others suggest that the entire crucifixion story is a myth, woven together from various ancient traditions. These theories have been extensively examined by both theologians and historians. The swoon theory, for example, is largely dismissed by medical experts who argue that the trauma inflicted on Jesus during the crucifixion would have made survival impossible. Mythicist theories, which argue that Jesus never existed or that the crucifixion is a later invention, struggle to account for the early historical references to Jesus and the rapid rise of Christianity. Ultimately, the question of whether the crucifixion happened as the Bible describes leads us to a deeper inquiry: the relationship between historical fact and theological truth. On one hand, there is substantial historical evidence to suggest that a man named Jesus of Nazareth was crucified under Pontius Pilate, as recorded by both Christian and non-Christian sources. On the other hand, the theological implications of the crucifixion, the understanding of Jesus as the Son of God, the atonement for sin, and the resurrection are matters of faith. Historians can provide insights into the cultural and political climate of first-century Judea. They can examine archaeological findings, and they can analyze ancient texts. But the ultimate significance of the crucifixion, and whether it happened exactly as the Bible describes, rests in the intersection of history and belief. In conclusion, the crucifixion of Jesus remains a historically plausible event, supported by various ancient sources, archaeological evidence, and medical analysis. Yet its meaning transcends the realm of history and enters the domain of faith. The event, as described in the Bible, offers a portrait not only of human suffering, but of divine redemption. Whether viewed through the lens of historical accuracy or theological truth, the crucifixion continues to be a subject of profound significance for both believers and scholars alike. If you want more details about how the crucifixion was done, check out this video on the right. Please do consider subscribing as well. Thanks for watching.